And in Matthew chapter 14. This is a totally different subject than what we've been talking about, so no use going back and saying, okay, let's review the parables and so forth. We'll just go right on in here now. Jesus has finished them, and then it said, at that season, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report concerning Jesus. So now, here we are introduced to Herod the Tetrarch. Now, this Herod the Tetrarch is different than Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great was the ruler of Palestine for many years, 20-some years, before Jesus was born. And he did a lot of building throughout that country, and he did the most massive, horrible things to the Jews, and the Jews hated him. There was a real deep hatred relationship between him and the Jews. Now, one of the things that made this relationship so bad is that Herod claimed to be a Jew. Now, he claimed to be a Jew only on this basis. It was very obvious he wasn't born of a Jewish dad and a Jewish mom. He was born down in Perea, but the people in the Jewish nation who was in control at that time was what's called the Maccabees family. And they went down to this country, Perea, and they conquered it, and then they gave all of those people an option. You either convert to Judaism or we kill you. And that was what they gave the whole nation. Guess how many people converted to Judaism? And so they converted that whole Gentile nation to Judaism, and they were all circumcised. Now, what's the biggest thing in Judaism? What's the most meaningful thing in Judaism, see? It's that circumcision. So if you're circumcised, it's something that's really great. All right? Herod then was his dad is the one that was converted, and so then he was born, of course, from his parents there, and so he then was religiously a Jew, but in every other aspect of his life, he was a Gentile. Now, his dad was a politician, and his dad was cuddling up to Rome all this period of time and doing Rome favors, and so he was a friend of Rome. Now, when Herod the Great comes along then, of course, he wasn't called Herod the Great until after he was almost dead, and then he did all those great things of buildings over there and so forth. But his son Herod came along, and Herod then went up and married into the Maccabean family. So when he married into the Maccabean family, why, they accepted him because he was a Jew. But he was only a Jew in that respect that he had been circumcised. So politically, what Herod the Great tried to do was to tell the Jews, I'm a Jew, so love me, and then to tell Rome and the Gentiles, I'm on your side, and he would always fight for them. So he's always causing the Jews trouble and killing the Jews and so forth and so on. So that's Herod the Great. Now, that's the Herod that was in power when Jesus was born. But within 2 years after Jesus was born, Herod the Great died. And then Herod the Great left a will and given the land to his sons. And so let's take a look right here at the land that we've got. Herod owned this whole land. As you look at it, you say, well, it looks like Palestine, and it is. You see it goes clear up into Caesarea Philippi in the north and down there. And so that whole area belonged to Herod. So Herod then divided it up among his 3 boys. Now, we don't know why he did this, but he divided it into 4 parts. This part down here in Judea, he gave to Archelaus. So that would be his son. Now, Archelaus was the guy that was in power when Jesus then came back out of Egypt. And his dad and mom was going to stay at Bethlehem. And they found out Archelaus was ruler down there. And they knew that Archelaus was just as vicious as his dad. So they went on back up to Nazareth. Now, Archelaus was so bad that finally Rome recalled him and took him out of office there. Then the other section of land that Herod divided up was up there in that area, and he gave his other son, Philip, that land. So now we have Philip Herod, or Herod Philip, then was given that land. Now then, there's 2 more sections of land. There's the land over here of Galilee, and this land on the other side of the Jordan River. Now, there you have your 4 sections of land. So, what do you suppose they will call a man if he rules over one of those 4 sections of land? The word ark means ruler. What does tetra mean? 4. So it was a fourth. So it was a ruler of a 4th part. He was a ruler of a 4th of the land that belonged to Herod the Great. But watch what happens. When you look at it, he gave Herod Antipas both sections. So Herod Antipas now gets both sections because he only had 3 sons. So you always come up with this then. If Herod had 3 sons, how could they be called a tetrarch? Well, they called a tetrarch because of the way they divided up the land that's there. So now, we've got then these guys that is there, and the guy we're talking about now is Herod Antipas. He's the guy that is under consideration in here. This time he was living over on the east side of the Jordan, down there about the end of that red mark that I've got. He had a palace that was down there. And so that's the Herod now that we're talking about. When you're studying the Gospels and the book of Acts, there's those 4 Herods, and then there's going to be another one thrown in as you get on down. Herod Agrippa in the book of Acts. He's going to be thrown in. He was a grandson that came up. So they all took the name Herod. It's kind of like Caesar's. They all took the name Caesar in Rome. So when you talk about a Caesar, you say, well, which one? What's his name? And so it is with Herod. Which one are we talking about? Okay, so it's this guy right here, Herod Antipas now. And so it says, at that season, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report concerning Jesus and said unto his servants, this is John, and this is John the Baptist, and he's risen from the dead, and therefore do all these powers work in him. Now, as you read Mark and Luke, you find that the citizens of the land at this time are really worked up. They're worked up. They're not mad at Jesus, but they are worked up in saying, who is this guy? Who is he to be able to do all of these powers that we've got? And so people were talking about him. Now then, his popularity is everywhere. The big question is, who is he? And so they were talking about it. Well, some of the wise guys among the Jews came up with some answers. What were their answers? Anybody remember what their answers were? Some said he was Elijah. Some said he's John the Baptist risen from the dead. And some said, well, he's one of the prophets. And so they were talking about who he might be there. Why didn't they just say, well, he is who he says he is? Wouldn't that be an interesting thing to do? He's come, he's done all these things. Instead of us trying to figure out who he is, why don't we just ask him, and then he is who he said he is. But they didn't do that. So in the country, what I'm trying to do is to kind of get it set up so we understand there was a political fervor that was going on. People were talking about one thing. Who is this guy who's doing all of this? And so the word came around to Herod then. And when Herod heard all the miracles that Jesus did, he jumped to a conclusion. Now, I think we can psychoanalyze Herod pretty well right here and not miss the mark too much. But here we see a guilty conscience talking. And he says, this is John the Baptist. And he's the guy that I killed. And he's afraid that Jesus is John the Baptist who has been raised from the dead. Well, if he is John the Baptist that's been raised from the dead, how would Herod feel? How secure would he feel? Knowing the way he would operate, why, he's sitting on pins and needles wondering what in the world here is going to happen. So he's come to this conclusion that he's John the Baptist now. Now then in verse 3, Matthew's going to tell us why Herod is upset about John the Baptist, and he's going to tell us how John the Baptist died. So here's the way he died. For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Now, here's a guy who had Herod, who had married his brother's wife, brother Philip's wife. You see the guy that was ruling the upper part there. So he married his wife, and John the Baptist condemned him for it. And Herodias, his new wife, she was vicious. She had tried to get Herod to kill John over and over and over again. But Herod wouldn't do it because Herod was scared. One thing he was scared of was the kind of man that John the Baptist was. And you don't just fool around with killing that kind of a guy, do you? In other words, you kill him, man, what are you doing? And the other reason, what was the other reason? The political reason why he was afraid to kill him. The people would rise up because they all held John in high esteem. So now, here it is, his wife, Herodias, is wanting him killed here then. Now, it says, the reason is, for John said unto him, it is not lawful for thee to have her. Now, this is a very brief statement on what turned out to be a very big subject. So somehow or another, and again, we don't know how the conversation came up. We don't know whether Herod asked Jesus. We don't know what it is. But asked John. But John just plainly told him, it's not lawful for thee to have her. Now what happened was that one time Philip, who's the ruler of that country over there, he went over to Rome, and he was living in Rome. And Herod Antipas went over to visit his brother. And during the visit of his brother, he started having an affair with his brother's wife, Herodias. And he talked her into divorcing Philip and marrying him. And so that's what they did. So Herod Antipas comes back then with a new wife. It's his brother's, Philip's wife. So the whole thing is based upon immorality and deceit, unlawfulness, in every way that you could possibly look at it. Brought him back over, and so they're living together now. This is where John the Baptist says, it is not lawful for thee to have her. Now, out of all the things that you might say this is lawful and so forth, you go back to Leviticus chapter 18, verse 16, and here you have the law of Moses. Now, why am I quoting the law of Moses in relationship to a guy like Herod? You remember, he claimed to be a Jew, see. He claimed to live under the law. So the law says, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness. Now that's a terminology of the Old Testament. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness, meaning have sexual relations with your brother's wife. The law said, you cannot do that. Again, and if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is impurity. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless. In other words, it is just one of those things that is specifically mentioned, specifically unlawful. You can't do it. And John the Baptist told Herod, you can't do that. Well, that's when Herodias, of course, goes into a temper tantrum. She had been trying to get John to kill him anyway in here, but she goes into the temper tantrum looking for a way to get rid of him. So now, it tells in verse 5 why John hadn't listened to her. And when he would have put him to death, that is, Herod would have put him to death because his wife wanting him to, but he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced in the midst and pleased Herod. Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she should ask. And she, being brought forward by her mother, saith, give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist. So here must have been a very beautiful girl. She came out and she danced in front of King Herod and all of these other kings and people that he had invited to this party. And it would have been a big drunken party. So she's out there and she does this seductive dance before them. He is so overwhelmed with all of this. He said, you ask me anything you want, I'll give it to you up to half of my kingdom. So all these people heard him make that oath. And it says, verse 9, or verse 8, instead of her saying what she wanted, she went back and asked Mama, and Mama said, you tell him you want John the Baptist's head on a platter. And so she goes back and tells him. And the king was grieved, but for the sake of his oaths and of them that sat at meat with him, he commanded it to be given. So now here's two reasons, two things that worked on Herod. You'll have to determine which one you think is the strongest. Because of his oath. Now, I don't know whether we could find anything about Herod to say his character was of such a nature that when he took an oath or said anything that he would die to keep it the way he should have. But for the sake of his oath, he had taken the oath, and he had taken the oath in front of these other men. And it said, and of them that sat at meat with him. So because of all these other guys, he knows that he will lose face among all of his comrades if he doesn't do it. He commanded it to be given. So the other writers say he said, told a soldier, go and behead him, bring his head back and give it to her. And he sent and beheaded John in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the damsel, that is the girl that danced, and she brought it to her mother. Now there's one of the most infamous stories that you find in the Bible. And as you look at that woman, what kind of a woman was she to ask such a thing as this? And if you had a head on a platter, what would you do if somebody brought it in and presented it to you? See, but she hated this guy, and that's what she got. Now, and his disciples came and took up the corpse and buried him, and they went and told Jesus. So when this happened, his disciples moved in, they take John out, and they bury him somewhere, and so John now is dead. How old would John have been at this time? About 32, somewhere in there, 31, 32 at this time. You remember how much older he was than Jesus? 6 months. And so Jesus has been preaching now for about a year and something. And so he would be here 31 and a half, 32, something of that nature. And so he died because of taking the stand there for the truth of God. Now when Jesus heard it, he withdrew from thence in a boat to a desert place apart. Now, what does the word desert mean? Because any time that I hear the word desert, and you tell me that you're going to the desert, what do you think of? Just sand, don't you? No trees, just sand, all of this. Well, this desert place where he went, as we'll later find out, he told the people, sit down on the grass. And where he went, there is no sand. It's all luscious green land that is there. What does the word desert mean? He went to a desert place. It means a deserted place, a place where there are no people that is living. And so here in western Washington, we go up here and find us a farm somewhere, and there's nobody up there, and there's 100 acres for us to go out and have a picnic on. We would be having a picnic out on a deserted or desert place. And so he goes out then on this desert place apart. And when the multitudes heard it thereof, they followed him on foot from the cities. And he came forth and saw a great multitude, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And when even was come, the disciples came to him, saying, the place is desert, and the time is already past. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. So now here is a multitude of people. Later we'll find the multitude. Anybody remember how big the multitude is? 5,000 men, plus the women and the children. So a large multitude of people. They have rushed out. They don't have any food. And so his disciples said, why don't you dismiss them? Evening is here. Let them go back and buy food because they're all hungry. Then 16. But Jesus said unto them, they have no need to go away. Give you them to eat. Now, John tells us that he did that to test Andrew. Andrew's the guy that came and asked him. And said he gave it to put him to a test, to see what he would say. that's kind of unique, because you know what would happen if there's a dozen people came to visit me, and I said, well, they don't need to go home. Helen will feed them tonight. She'd faint. Well, that's what he did. He just, there's too much. You can't do that. But this is a test period. Now, put yourself in their shoes and you tell me what you would have done. Had you have seen Jesus do all of these other miracles, and then he makes this statement, he said, you feed him, would you have had the faith to say, oh, if he says feed him, then I'll be able to feed him. I don't have any food. He didn't have a morsel of food. I'll be able to feed him. Or would you have said what he did? We don't have any food. Well, it shows you that they had not come to the point yet of saying, if Jesus says do something, we'll just do it. We'll just do it. The faith of the disciples hadn't come that far yet. So, he said, they have no need, give them to eat. And they say unto him, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Now, when you look at 5 loaves, how big would 5 loaves of bread been in their culture? A loaf of bread was about the size of a small pancake. That's what it was. It's flat, made in a disc, looked like a pancake, not one of these big pancakes that overflows, but just a small saucer-type pancake. So they had 5 of those, what we'd say wafers of bread, and they had 2 fishes. Now, what size would these fish be? Would they be 40-pound salmon? No, he got them out of the Sea of Galilee. And in the Sea of Galilee, there's only about 3 kinds of fish in there. There's some little minnows, and then there's some others, and they're about that long, about 6, maybe 8 inches long in there. And so if they got the big ones, well, that's what it would be, about an 8-incher. And take that, and he said, that's all we got. And he said, bring them hither to me. And he commanded the multitudes to set down on the what? Grass. And he took the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples to the multitudes, and they all ate and were filled, and they took up that which remained over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And they that did eat were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So, how did he do this miracle? Let me ask you, was this one miracle, or was this 5,000 miracles, or 10,000 miracles? How many people would have been there? If there's 5,000 men, how many women would have come, and kids? How many additional people? See, would have been there. Everybody said, well, it'd probably been at least that many that was there. Women are inclined to be much more interested in spiritual things than men in general. And so, yeah, so we're probably talking about 10,000 people. But let's just take a little old 5,000, okay? And then we'll give a few bits to these others here. Now, he starts breaking this thing off. He got this little wafer like this. Starts breaking it off. He breaks off a chunk big enough to feed a man. He takes it away. Breaks off another chunk big enough to feed a man. He takes it away. Breaks off another chunk, gives it here, he gives it to the guy, he takes it away. 5,000 times he does that. What happened? How was that done? Overwhelming. Never ran out. And he gave them more than what they could eat. Because at the end they picked up 12 basketfuls. Now, with those 5 little wafers and 2 fish, would they have made a basket full? Now, if you'd even started out to put them in a basket, you could hardly see them in the bottom of a basket. But now there's 12 basketfuls there. So here we have that super abundant miracle that he is performing. And I think you could say 5,000-10,000 miracles all wrapped up in one. It just kept happening, kept happening, kept happening, and kept happening. Well, then it comes down here that he did this, and then straightway he constrained the disciples. What does straightway mean? immediately, very soon after. So soon as he fed them, it'd be the evening time, and straightway he constrained the disciples to enter into the boat. That is, he forced them. Yeah, you guys go. You go get in the boat, and he's going to stay there. But you go get in the boat and go home. So he constrained them to enter the boat and go before him unto the other side till he should send the multitude away. So he said, you guys get in the boat, you go back to the other side. Where would they be going? What would be the name of the town? We're told in the other epistles, I don't think it tells us here, but it's up at Capernaum and up in Bethsaida. There are two little cities right next to each other that's there, and it's up in the northern part of the lake there. And so he sent them away and said, you go up there. And after he had sent the multitude away, he went up into the mountain apart to pray. And when even was come, he was there alone. But the boat was now in the midst of the sea, distressed by the waves, for the winds were contrary. Now, I didn't bring it in again because I've shown it to you 2 or 3 times, and that is the Sea of Galilee. That as you look at the Sea of Galilee, and you look over on the west side, over there where Tiberias is, this is where John says he was when he fed the 5,000, was down there around Tiberias. And so they're going to be going up to Capernaum that's up there. So he sent them away. This over here is the Jewish side, that was the Roman side. So he sent them away, and it's 9 miles to go up into that area there. So he goes up to pray. He sent them away. Now, you remember that sheer cliff that I've shown you of where the wind comes over and just zoop down and rakes up all of those storms? Well, you see, that sheer cliff is right there. In fact, if you look at the green, I'd use this laser, but it's not working here. But if you look at that light green is the grassy area, and then that lighter green, I don't know what color that thing would be, almost white, that is in there. That is right over here. That's the big mountain. And it's a big mountain, and that is a sheer cliff that goes straight down. And so that wind would come up, and down it would go, and it would just be a wind tunnel. And so it comes down, and it's causing the storm that's out on the sea. Now, it said they were distressed. They were in the middle, about halfway up there. They'd been rowing in there all this time. They were distressed, for the wind was contrary. And in the 4th watch of the night, what time would that be? They had 4 periods of time that they would put watchmen out. You started at what time? 6 in the evening. From 6 to 9 is the first. 9 to 12 is the second. 12 to 3 o'clock in the morning is the third. And from 3 to 6 is the fourth. So what time are they out there? They're out there after 3 o'clock in the morning. What time did they leave? They left about dark, a little bit before dark. And how far had they traveled? Got up there about 4 miles, out there in the middle of that. They should have been there for hours and hours and hours ago, but they're out there battling for their life in the middle of that sea. And it says in 25, and in the 4th watch of the night he came unto them walking upon the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a ghost. Now, that word in the Greek is really not ghost, it's an aberration. It's an aberration. What's an aberration anyway? He says ghost. It's something you can't explain, isn't it? If I was writing a dictionary, I think that's about the way I'd put it. See, it's something you can't explain. It's something you see, but you can't explain what the thing is. And so this thing out there is a spirit. It's an aberration. It's a ghost of some kind. And they cried out for fear. They're scared to death. Now try to put yourself in that boat. And of course, I know that everybody in here is brave and all that, and you wouldn't be scared at all. But if you'd been rowing for how long? 9 hours? If you'd been rowing for 9 hours in a windstorm, about to be turned over, fighting that sea for about 9 hours, would you be shook up? And then if you look up and out on the water, here comes a thing walking. And it's walking right towards you. Now I want to ask you, what would you do tonight if it were in the pitch dark, if you walked out in your backyard and you looked up and you saw a thing walking toward you? What would you do? Would you just, bet I can tell what Betty says here. You know, you would say, well, hi, how you doing there? You see, you can't tell what it is, and man, and the old heart would start pumping blood. Well, think what it was out there. There shouldn't be anybody walking on that water. Now, these things really happened, and I'm kind of just trying to bring it out so that we say, wow, they had lots of things going against them in there. They'd been rowing all this time, and now then they see this, and so they cried out for fear. They started crying out. And straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. Everybody be happy, don't be afraid. It's I. And Peter answered and said, Lord, if it be you, bid or invite me to come to thee upon the waters. Now, we might stop right here because here we're going to start learning a little bit about Peter. And we're going to learn a whole lot about Peter before we get through. Peter is what is called a very impetuous man. Peter had a character unlike any of the others. Of course, that's not new because no two people have characters the same. But Peter's character was of a nature that stood out. He was always a man who would jump in and start something before he really thought it through. And a lot of times he'd try to back out, he'd be scared to death before he realized what he had done. At other times he'd just go right on and do it. But he's a rather impetuous man in making these decisions. And so without a lot of thought, if that's you, Lord, invite me to walk on the water with you. Now I want to know how many of you, before we condemn Peter, I want to know how many of you would have the nerve to do that. If you'd actually see an apparition walking on water, he's out there somewhere. You can't tell it's him, but you can hear his voice. It's I, don't be afraid. So he's out there. He's not right next to the boat. Lord, if that's you, invite me to get out. Now what about the wind and the waves? This is the middle of a storm. How many of you would ask him to get out and walk on the water with him? It wouldn't even have entered my mind. Wouldn't even have entered my mind to do that. But Peter said, do it. And he said, well, come on. So he invited him to come on out. He said, come. And Peter went down from the boat and walked upon the water to come to Jesus. So he just went down and started walking on the water. He's walking on the water just exactly like Jesus was walking on the water. There was no difference between the two. So he's headed out toward Jesus. Remember, Jesus is out there far enough they couldn't tell who he was. It looked like an aberration out there. But when he saw the wind, how do you see the wind? You see the results of the wind. What do you see as the results of the wind on a lake? Those big waves that's out there. And when he saw what he was walking on out in this storm, he was afraid and beginning to sink. And he cried out saying, Lord, save me. And by this time, he's up there getting close to Jesus. Jesus stretched forth his hands and took hold of him and saith unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? So, takes hold of him, pulls him back up on the water. It doesn't tell us what happened then. I suppose he held his hand and they walked back on the water. I suppose it doesn't tell us there. But they walk back and they get in the boat. Now, before we look at anything else, how would you feel if you were not just Peter, but if you were one of the other 11 guys that was in that boat? And you had experienced this whole thing for 9 hours. Then you had experienced this aberration that just absolutely petrified you. And then one of your buddies said, let me walk, and he jumps out and actually starts walking on water. He gets out and then he starts to go under and he starts crying. And Jesus reaches down and pulls him back up, brings him back up on top of the water, puts him back in the boat. Stop. how would you feel at that moment? Can you put yourself in that boat and think how you would feel? You'd just be awestruck, wouldn't you? Just absolutely be awestruck. What is happening? How's it happening? And when they had crossed, in 33, and they that were in the boat worshipped him, saying, of a truth, thou art the Son of God. They are so overwhelmed by this. This does more to them than the feeding of the 5,000. Of a truth, thou art the Son of God. It's kind of like saying, it's really true. It's actually true. You are who you say you are. Well, the only person that could possibly do this would be somebody that can control the weather, the winds, and the waves, and walk on water. And so now they've broken down, and they're saying, of a truth, thou art the Son of God. Now, how long will that last? How long will that conviction last? Let me ask you another question. Had you been there and had you seen that, would you have been firmly convicted so you would never have lost your faith again? So you would just be solid as a rock from then on? It seems to me like I would have. See? It seems to me like I would have. It just seems to me like, had I seen that, I'd have said, Lord, I'm with you all the way. You don't ever have to worry about me again. Whatever you say, I'll do. It seems to me that way. But it didn't happen to these 12 guys. And so, I know what would have happened to me. Had I been there, I'd been just like them. And this idea that Jesus is presenting himself as the Son of God is big. It's big. Now, it's not to you and me. When you came in and you sat down in this audience tonight, everybody in here believed Jesus was the Son of God. There's no use of me standing up here trying to prove that he's the Son of God. There's no use of me trying to prove it. Everybody says he's the Son of God. But put yourself back there. At this time, this was the big, big, big thing. This is bigger than the California election is today, see? California election taking up all of this time and comments and people talking about it. And you can't turn on the TV without it coming out. What was the conversation at that time? See? Who is this guy who claims to be the Son of God? Who really is he? See? Who really is he? And so that's what they were talking about. And so Jesus is doing these miracles, these disciples seeing them. But now then, this one has broken their back. This one has caused them to say, we have to give up. Of a truth, he is the Son of God. Well, it'll be interesting to find, in just a little while, we'll find Peter rebuking Jesus and telling him he's all wrong, that he needs to give him some good advice and so forth. And let's put it in perspective and see, that's what we can be today in here. Let me ask you, I said we all came in here believing Jesus is the Son of God. How strong is your faith? How strong is it? Do you believe it so strongly that you're willing to die for it without question? Are you willing to sacrifice your children or your money, your house? Are you really willing to do that without even thinking about it? That's what I want to know. Or if you'd say, well, give me a little time to think. Do I have any faith? Is your faith strong enough that it's already made up? Whatever it is, that's what I'll do. And I don't even want to discuss it. Because I know Jesus is the Son of God. It's something to think about, isn't it? See? Those guys lived in a different era, but we live down here in this era. And our problem today is, their problem back there, all this evidence coming in on them was so big, it was so mighty, it was so much, it was so unbelievable It was so outstanding. It was so incomprehensible. How could their mind absorb it so that they could just really put it in? That's not our problem today. Our problem today is, I've been taught this all my life. I read it in the Bible. It's no big deal. I hear preachers preach on it all the time. It's no big deal. Yeah, yeah. Jesus is the Son of God. And there's nothing happening that really puts us to the test so that we have to see, do we really believe He's the Son of God? See, now, I'm not saying just because we live in this luxurious, pain-free generation that means that we don't believe it. I'm not accusing you, and I'm not accusing me. Everybody in this audience might be willing to die just at the snap of a finger for Jesus Christ. But what I'm saying is, we haven't had anything to come in our life to prove it. So test yourself. These guys right here are going through a big problem. And when he had crossed over, he came to the land unto Gennesaret. So he goes back up to Capernaum. Oh, by the way, there's an interesting thing that John says, I think it is. He's out there about 4.5 miles up that lake, and that's where he met them walking on the water. And when he put Peter in the boat, immediately the boat was on shore. Another miracle. If it took them 9 hours to row the first 4.5 hours, how long do you expect they thought it would take them to get the last 4.5 miles? But got him in? Bing. It's there. Another miracle. Okay. When they'd crossed over, that is to get back up to Capernaum, they came to the land that is called Gennesaret. So that's the land that is down here now, going this direction, and it's 5 miles away. And they took a boat, and they went down there. And when the men of that place knew him, they sent unto all the region round about, and brought unto him all that were sick, that they besought him, that they might only touch the border of his garment, and as many as touched him were made whole. So when he gets down there, everybody hears that he's down there, and John tells us that people from Tiberias, they'd come up to see him, and they're chasing him down. And so now we have a massive number of people that's here trying to chase Jesus down. And everybody, when they're coming, they're bringing their sick, they're laying them out, they're asking him to heal them. And as he goes by, any person that he touches or anybody that touches him, they're immediate to heal. Would that make an impression on you? Now, what are all of these miracles for? And so you ask yourself, was there enough evidence that Jesus presented during his life? Was there enough evidence in all these miracles that he did? In the bread, 5,000 miracles at one time, in walking on the water, raising the dead, healing all these sick, everybody that brought their sick into them, massive numbers. Was there enough evidence for people to see this man is a different kind of man? This is what was turning the world upside down at that time. Who is this guy? That's the problem that they're wrestling with at this time. Okay, there's where we'll close our class for